Yeah, there
We're
went the
not in court.
coverage.
They just told us. They just told
All
us
right.
this is a free show here.
Now that we've killed the lights, we'll call the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology to order and welcome our witnesses here today and our colleagues. Thanks for your patience with our late start. We had a vote on the floor, as you know. But we appreciate your being here today and look forward to your testimony. From the time the administration announced their intent to transition IANA functions from ICANN to the international multi-stakeholder community, I've had very serious concerns about the potential risks associated with that move. We've said time and again that this is far too important to rush and that we must carefully consider all of the consequences and outcomes before we ring a bell that cannot be unrung. This subcommittee has been committed to oversight of the transition process and ensuring that there are safeguards in place to improve the odds of a successful transition and preserve the Internet. We are all committed to protecting. Last Congress, we held hearings on this topic and passed .com Act out of the full committee almost exactly a year ago. The goals of the .com Act are consistent with our position. It is the appropriate role of this subcommittee to oversee the NTIA and in this case ensure that it thoroughly evaluates any proposal. As part of this oversight, we've already asked the GAO to begin an inquiry into the process that examines the existing contract, risks to be considered, and any safeguards that can be put into place to reduce the threats to the future operations and functions of the Internet. Many have come to us to emphasize the importance of the IANA transition to the continued success of the multi-stakeholder model of governance and to urge us to be mindful of the way the international community perceives our actions. We recognize these considerations, but we also feel it would be irresponsible to ignore the very real risks associated with a relinquishment of the U.S. role in Internet governance, no matter how symbolic. This is why we've taken the measured approach that we'll discuss today. NTIA put forward a set of criteria that they say any acceptable transition proposal must meet, all of which are essential to ensuring a vibrant Internet should NTIA transition IANA to the multi-stakeholder community. NTIA should be applauded for this and for its willingness to stick to these criteria despite the difficulty in meeting them. Our goal through this legislation and our efforts in the subcommittee is to ensure that these conditions are met and that the myriad unforeseen complications that could arise in meeting them are addressed. I'm pleased to report the staff from both sides of the aisle have been working together to produce an amendment to the .com Act that meets these goals that we all share without unduly burdening the agency as it works towards its goal. While NTIA works within its proper role in the multi-stakeholder model, we too are working within our proper role as oversight authority. While we have not reached agreement on final text, our discussions have been very promising, and there's an important role for Congress in this transition, and I commend the staff for their hard work. I'd also like to take a moment to touch on the timeline of the transition. It seems that everyone, including NTIA Administrator Larry Strickling, has acknowledged that the important work needed to facilitate a transition cannot be done before the existing contract expires on September 30th, 2015. I urge NTIA to exercise the 2-year renewal option on the contract. Doing so allows the deliberative process to continue without artificial pressure or time constraints, and this won't provide any additional hurdle to the transition itself. Should NTIA and ICANN come to agreement on an acceptable proposal before the 2-year period is up, the contract can be canceled to facilitate that transition. I'm pleased to have our panel of stakeholder witnesses here today to give us an update on their views of this transition. In the past year, thousands of hours of hard work have taken place, many by our witnesses at the witness table today, to move this forward. Our last hearing gave voice to concerns that have been incorporated into the work of the multi-stakeholder working groups, and this is an opportunity for us to once again play our role in the process. I thank the witnesses for being here, and I look forward to your expertise. With that, I'd recognize the gentlelady from California, my friend, the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Eshoo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon to all the members and to all of our witnesses. We welcome you here, and we thank you for your willingness to come and share your thoughts with us about this is an important topic. Earlier this year, Singapore's Minister of Communication and Information, Dr. Yaakob bin Ibrahim, stated that, quote, "No one person, organization, or even country has a monopoly on the expertise and wisdom needed to meet the challenges that we're facing on the internet on a day-to-day basis, unquote. I agree with that quote and his thought. It's why Congress, on a bipartisan, bicameral basis, has consistently stated that the United States should continue to preserve and advance the multi-stakeholder governance model under which the Internet has thrived. Our leadership in the IANA transition is critical, but I think inserting a unilateral role for our government, as the .com Act does, undermines the legitimacy of the multi-stakeholder model, and it emboldens those that don't agree with us. Some call them our enemies, but I think that emboldens us, emboldens them. For nearly 20 years, it's been U.S. policy to transition the government's role in administering the domain name system to the multi-stakeholder global community. And by requiring the GAO to study the pros and cons of making such a transition, the .com Act fails to recognize this history. Equally concerning is the opposition from the stakeholder community, including NetChoice's Steve Del Bianco, who's here and is going to be testifying today, that a post-analysis by GAO of the transition proposal is no longer necessary. The success of the IANA transition depends on built-in mechanisms for transparency and accountability, and a commitment by ICANN to resist. Mr. Chairman, I don't think the committee's in order. You guys have to, that means stop gabbing to my left. It's distracting. The success of the IANA transition depends on built-in mechanisms for transparency and accountability, and a commitment by ICANN to resist any expansion of the role governments or intergovernmental organizations may play in ICANN's deliberations. Now, if the majority shares these goals, and I believe that you do, then we should work together on a bipartisan alternative to the .com Act, which provides a reasonable period of time for Congress and the general public to review the IANA transition proposal. With responsible oversight, a successful transition of those functions will preserve the Internet's guiding principles of openness, of security, of stability, and resiliency, and ensure ICANN cannot be exposed to government capture. Again, I'd like to thank the panel of witnesses. They're all, they're really esteemed individuals in each one of their spheres of influence. And I think that each one of them understands the Internet's guiding values and the importance of the multi-stakeholder model. So again, I thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time unless someone else would like it. Doris, would you like my time? I'd be glad to yield to you. To the gentlewoman from California.
Thank you very much, my fellow colleague. Got the wrong thing here from the previous. In 2012, with strong bipartisan congressional backing, the administration's position was strengthened in reaffirming the current multi-stakeholder approach that has allowed the Internet to flourish here in the United States and around the world. Congress must stay united moving forward. I'm pleased to hear that the administration will not support any proposal that undermines the openness of the Internet. With over 2 billion users, we all know the Internet has become a necessity and not a luxury. It plays a dominant role in the world economy. We need to continue to promote innovation, openness of the Internet around the globe. That has been the hallmark of U.S. policy. I believe the multi-stakeholder approach must continue to define Internet governance, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, the vice chair of the subcommittee, Mr. Latta.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for our witnesses for being with us today. The Internet has quickly integrated into our everyday lives and has become a central platform for job creation, education, business development, healthcare, and free expression. Therefore, the preservation of the Internet's openness and freedom should remain a high priority as NTIA prepares to transition the U.S. government's role in the Internet's numbering functions to a global multi-stakeholder community. I thank the gentleman, my friend from Illinois, for introducing the .com Act to ensure proper oversight of this transition. This bill will safeguard our national security interests and allow citizens to continue to freely navigate the Internet. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and Mr. Chairman, I would at this time yield to the gentleman from Illinois the balance of my time.
Thank you. I want to thank Chairman Walden and Chairman Upton for holding this hearing today. While we all use the Internet, few Americans, and I'm included, few Americans truly understand the underlying Internet architecture. Perhaps that is because the system that has been in place has worked so well that we don't need to think about it. The Internet remains a free and open place to exchange information and ideas, and the goal of my legislation has always been to preserve that for future generations. What we wanted to do with the .com Act has always been to exercise vigorous oversight on the transition and make sure it's done right. The old trust but verify statement. As a legislative body, specifically in the Telecom Subcommittee, we have authority and responsibility to oversee the activities of NTIA. We get one bite at the apple with this. We would be negligent in our responsibilities to not ensure that NTIA and the administration is living up to its promises. NTIA says the proposal must, and this is from them, support and enhance the multi-stakeholder model, maintain a security, stability, and resiliency of the Internet DNS, meet the needs and expectations of the global customers and partners of the IANA services, and maintain the openness of the Internet. I have concerns that these requirements that NTIA has put forth are vague at best, but allowing Congress a chance to review any proposal would hold the administration's feet to the fire before any transition could occur. If the proposal isn't as promised and ICANN hasn't made the necessary changes to facilitate the transition, then Congress has the chance to engage in other legislative avenues to ensure that Americans will continue to access a free and open Internet. Bipartisan staff discussions are ongoing, and we're hopeful that an agreement can be reached to hold NTIA accountable to their own criteria and move it to the floor and to the President's desk. We just have to be careful by exercising congressional oversight of NTIA because there's no turning back once this moves forward. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for a record an article that came out today, What's in a Domain Name by Peter Ruff, and it was in U.S. News and World Report.
Without objection.
And I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Chair recognizes the ranking member from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The subject of today's hearing is the transition of the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, or IANA, and this function is sometimes called the Internet's phone book of Internet names and numbers, and more simply, it's what allows Internet users to easily navigate the web. The Internet is an unprecedented platform for economic opportunity and democratic free expression. It's used by 3 billion people around the globe. And because this phone book has worked so well, very few of us ever have to think about how it works. We just know it works. And that's a credit to a successful Internet governance model that uses a multi-stakeholder approach to decision-making. We all want this success story to continue, and that's why the U.S. government has taken steps over the past 2 decades to get out of the way and allow the private sector to assume management of the domain name system. Put another way, we think the future of the Internet should be determined by businesses, civil society, and technical experts. Both Republican and Democratic administrations have supported the idea that the Internet should be governed through a decentralized, bottom-up process that is free from government control, and Congress, too, has embraced this vision. In 2013, the House voted unanimously in support of a bill making it official U.S. policy to, quote, preserve and advance a successful multi-stakeholder model that governs the Internet. I personally believe that the transition of the IANA functions to the global multi-stakeholder community helps achieve that goal. Since NTIA announced last March its intention to relinquish control of the IANA contract, they have made significant progress to plan for this transition. They've also made impressive strides to enhance accountability for ICANN, NTIA has clearly and consistently articulated principles for the transition in keeping with the U.S. government's support for the multi-stakeholder model and an open global internet. I believe Congress has a bipartisan interest in seeing the IANA transition executed consistent with these principles. We all have a shared interest in transparency and accountability, and I therefore thank my Republican colleagues, especially Chairman Walden and Mr. Shimkus, for working with us to address concerns with the .com Act, and I look forward to continuing our shared responsibility to conduct rigorous oversight of NTIA and to ensure the agency lives up to its commitments for the transition. So again, this thank you to the witnesses today for sharing their perspectives that they're going to on the proposals that have been put forward and the work that remains to be done. And thank you to both the chairman and our ranking member, Ms. Eshu, for putting this together and the work that we're going to do together on this. I think both Mr. Doyle and Ms. Matsu, you've already spoken, right? Does anyone else want any time? He says he doesn't, so. All right, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Thank you for your kind comments. We look forward to continuing our work together. Now we'll go to our witnesses, and we'll start with Steve Del Bianco, Executive Director of NetChoice. We're delighted to have you with us today. Turn on that mic, pull it up close, and we look forward to your testimony, sir. Go ahead.
Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshu, members of the committee, thank you very much for having yet another important hearing on this transition. I am deeply involved at ICANN, 30 meetings and 5 times elected as the policy chair for the business constituency. And partly on the inspiration of your hearing last year, I got deeply involved in the transition planning. I represent the commercial stakeholders globally on the transition planning team. This was a year ago in April when you held the first hearing on NTIA's plan to transition oversight. And I think that what that focused on was the fact that over 17 years, our government has protected ICANN's multi-stakeholder model from government encroachment and really helped ICANN to mature. The analogy I suggested to you last year is that the U.S. built this car called IANA in the 1990s. We handed the car keys to ICANN in 1998 when we created ICANN, but we kept the ownership papers. We kept the title close. We monitored their driving and their care of the vehicle for those last 17 years. But look, it's just not sustainable for the U.S. alone to hold that title forever, especially in a post-Snowden political climate, which really has nothing to do with the DNS, but politically it's connected. So the NTIA asked the community for proposals to replace the stewardship role for IANA, and the global multi-stakeholder community responded to the challenge. We have had hundreds of meetings in the last several months, tens of thousands of person hours have gone in, often overnight since we cycle through different time zones for our friends in Asia and all around the world. And I can tell you I've learned to keep my mute on mic after 2 o'clock in the morning. Our community proposals are an excellent start. I summarized them in my testimony. Let me give you some highlights. We are giving, for the first time, we're giving the community new powers to challenge the board's decisions and actions via an independent review panel that can issue binding decisions. We are allowing the community to veto bylaws changes proposed by the board of directors, to veto strategic plans and budgets proposed by ICANN's board, the power to remove an individual director, and better still, to spill the entire board if they're not listening to the community. Now, we assessed whether these new powers give the community the accountability we need in the face of stress tests. And Chairman Walden, you indicated a certain appreciation for that in the first hearing. Good news, they answered quite well. We did 26 stress tests, and the new mechanisms I've just described allowed the community to have the powers we needed to challenge the board decision and hold them accountable. But there were some stress tests that needed even further changes. Last June, this committee raised some very stressful questions of your own, drawing on the .com Act, to put together a set of requests for GAO, Government Accountability Office, to analyze the risks and implications for national security and U.S. agencies. Both our stress test that I talked to you about and your third GAO question asked, what happens if ICANN quits the affirmation of commitments? That's a great question because they can quit with 120 days notice, particularly if they don't have to stay in it to keep the IANA contract. So we took ICANN's commitments in the affirmation and the periodic reviews of the community and have baked them into ICANN's bylaws as part of the proposal we released last week. And earlier I said that if ICANN tried to take those commitments out of the bylaws, the community can block that change. Another is we channeled your second GAO question. Another one came from the .com Act. It said, what if the Government Advisory Committee changed to majority voting for its advice that they give to ICANN? This would truly expand government's power. We said in the working group that changing ICANN bylaws was essential so that we only are obligated to seek a mutually acceptable solution to this government advice if the government advice came over with consensus. So let them change their voting method, but only consensus carries that obligation. Turning back to the proposals that I had earlier, we need details that we haven't provided yet. We were still in draft 1, and the entire global stakeholder community has to review what we've come up with. So it will not happen by September 2015 IANA deadline. The timeline I got here on a board and in my testimony shows that your committee's good work on requesting GAO to start its analysis last June is really going to pay off. They've been at it for several months. I've had 2 extensive, exhausting meetings with GAO. They're asking great questions, and it would be immensely valuable to see the GAO analysis during the comment period we're having right now and the second one this summer. That would be more valuable form of the .com Act than having GAO only start their analysis when we're finished and after the community has already developed the proposals. So even with the extension, we really worry that ICANN's board and management will resist the reforms that we're talking about because they're tough medicine. Mr. Schaefer will address that in his testimony later on. The role of Congress in this transition could be critical. We think you ought to insist that NTIA require ICANN to accept and implement the final form of our proposals for new accountability as a condition of getting the IANA transition. And that's why on my chart I show them in the upper right-hand corner to accept and implement. And it'll be up to NTIA to make sure that that's the case. We'd like you to support and encourage and insist upon NTIA to do that. And I'll conclude by saying this is, as you've indicated, our last chance to use the leverage that we're about to relinquish because this driver is about to turn 18. And it's time to sign over the title to this car, but not until we're sure that ICANN is answerable to the community we designed it to serve.
Thank you very much.
Excellent testimony.
Turn over the title, but who's paying for the insurance? That's what I want to know.
That's the expensive part,
That's
Mr.
the
Chairman.
expense. Anybody with a teenager knew that. We're going to go now to Danielle Kale, who's the Senior Policy Analyst at the New America's Open Technology Institute. Danielle, we welcome you and thank you for participating in our hearing today.
Thank you, Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the subcommittee. As a researcher and active participant in global internet governance issues, I appreciate the committee's desire to preserve a free and open internet and believe that a swift and orderly IANA transition is key to achieving that goal. While I share the committee's concern that if the IANA transition goes badly, it could harm internet freedom, the best way to prevent that outcome and to ensure the continued stability of the internet's domain name system is to support the ongoing process. The U.S. government's oversight role has long been a political target, an exaggerated symbol that overshadows our good intentions in the global internet governance space. And it's time to step aside, which will ultimately help us in our ongoing efforts to prevent government overreach on other internet governance issues. The first point that I'd like to emphasize today is that this is the right time for the IANA transition to happen and without unnecessary delay. The transition is long overdue, both historically and politically. It's the logical conclusion of the sequence that began in 1998 when the U.S. government first announced that it would privatize the DNS. And it's a formal recognition that the internet is now a truly global network. There's broad consensus today that no single country should have exclusive jurisdiction over the internet's core infrastructure, and that the system needs to evolve in ways that benefit users all around the world. That's why a wide range of internet stakeholders support the decision to complete the transition to a community-based, non-governmental institution. As former FCC Commissioner Robert McDowell put it, it's time to get the government out of the internet governance business. And we can't forget that NTIA made it clear from the very beginning that this oversight role would be temporary. The justifications for it in 2015 are considerably weaker than they were in 1998. There's also significant evidence that if NTIA had not voluntarily decided to begin the transition, other internet stakeholders would have tried to force its hand. For all these reasons, the decision last year to initiate the transition and establish a community-driven multi-stakeholder process is the only way to ensure that the transition happens in such a way that it addresses both the needs of the global community and the interests of the U.S. government. Second, the process of developing the transition and accountability proposals, as I think my colleagues on the panel will also say, is proceeding reasonably well. Last year, NTIA laid out 5 clear principles that any transition plan must meet, and the development of this plan is receiving significant input from a wide range of stakeholders. Yes, the process is complex, but there's still reason to believe that when the dust settles, there will be a real community consensus about what the transition should look like, and that it will include appropriate safeguards to ensure the system's ongoing stability. And NTIA is firmly positioned to reject any proposals that fail to meet its criteria. At the heart of all of this is the question of ICANN accountability. Specifically, after it's freed from U.S. government oversight, what will prevent ICANN from taking on a global governance role far outside of its core commitments? There are important issues that need to resolve, including how to make sure that the community has the means to correct any misuses of ICANN's power. But these questions are best addressed through the existing accountability process, whose working group recently released its initial draft proposal, 142 pages, for review. So finally, while I share the committee's concern that the stakes are high, legislation like the .com Act is not necessary, and although surely unintentional, could actually make it substantially more difficult for the U.S. government to make sure that the transition happens smoothly. Imposing a delay would appear to be an act of bad faith, and it will be poorly received internationally. It will look like an attempt to substitute the U.S. government's judgment for the global communities. Preventing NTIA from completing the transition is also inconsistent with the previous statements that were mentioned in opening remarks about unanimous support for the multi-stakeholder internet governance model. And finally, it would play into the hands of foreign governments who seek to undermine the system and strengthen their opposition to the U.S. on a broad range of free expression issues. To conclude, I think we're all in agreement that the IANA transition is a significant opportunity for the United States and for internet users worldwide. And we appreciate the committee's engagement on this incredibly important issue. But the best way to ensure that it goes well and to achieve our broader shared goal of protecting a free and open internet is to let the community complete its work before deciding what the next step should be. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Kale. Appreciated your comments and your insights. We'll go now to Audrey Plonk, who's the Director of Global Cybersecurity and Internet Governance Policy for the Intel Corporation. Ms. Plonk, we're delighted to have you before the committee. Please go ahead.
Apologies. Good afternoon, Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I am Audrey Plonk, Director of Global Cybersecurity and Internet Governance Policy at Intel. I'm here to express Intel's unequivocal support for the successful and timely transition of the stewardship of the IANA functions contract in support of the multi-stakeholder community. Intel has actively followed and participated in the transition process. Technology advances built on U.S. innovation have driven unprecedented economic growth in the U.S. and abroad. Intel has been at the center of this innovation for more than 40 years. In 2014, Intel did $55.9 billion of business and employed 107,000 people worldwide, 60,000 in the United States. Though Intel is incorporated here, our presence, impact, and revenues span the globe. I cannot stress enough the importance of trust to our current and future success. We have observed a trend toward diminished trust in the U.S. government and U.S. companies, both at home and abroad. Any real or perceived failure in the transition in the form of an externally imposed or mandated delay will only heighten mistrust in the U.S. government and embolden governments threatened by a free and open internet, to the detriment of the many internet technology companies headquartered in this country. Intel is not a provider of domain name services, nor a registry or a registrar. We are not a contracted party to ICANN. Quite simply, we design and manufacture the computing power of the internet. Though the IANA functions are extremely important, they are fundamentally administrative and involve updating and maintaining 3 related but separate registries: names, numbers, and protocols. The IANA neither makes policy nor exercises judgment. It simply follows a mechanical process to maintain and update these registries according to explicitly defined rules. Without these functions, connected devices will not fully realize their potential to improve the lives of everyone on Earth. Today, those rules are developed through multi-stakeholder processes through which all interested and affected parties participate. Much of the global debate on internet governance centers on this process and whether it is sufficient to govern the internet going forward. The most widely supported alternative to multi-stakeholder governance is multilateral governance, in which an intergovernmental body, such as the United Nations, makes governance decisions. In this scenario, the overall influence of the United States government is diminished to a single vote, and the ability for direct participation from industry and civil society is largely eliminated. Again, any real or perceived failure in the transition emboldens hostile governments to push this process toward the United Nations or another intergovernmental body. Recognizing this, the U.S. Congress has consistently and publicly supported multi-stakeholder internet governance, as was previously mentioned in opening statements. In 2012, Congress unanimously passed a resolution to preserve and advance a successful multi-stakeholder model that governs the internet today. And just last year, thanks to the foresight and leadership of this committee, this policy was reaffirmed in H.R. 1580, which passed the House unanimously. It is Intel's view that the transition of the IANA functions is in fact advancing multi-stakeholder governance in line with this stated policy. The transition is on an excellent path. As of today, there are 4 proposals, 2 complete from numbers and protocols, and 2 in draft format from names and accountability, covering all aspects of the transition. Most importantly, especially for this committee and for congressional oversight, these proposals have been and will continue to be developed in a completely open and transparent fashion. Anyone with an interest can review and comment and access the entire record of past discussion to understand how decisions were reached. The internet doubles in size every 10.5 months and has done so for 30 years. Technology is changing all the time. Keeping up with that rate of exponential growth requires all the parts of the internet to be continuously improved. Not only the technical functions, but the political and policy functions as well. We can't leave the politics and policies in the 20th century while the technology advances into the 21st. The transition is entering its final stages. We ask that you support allowing the names community and the accountability working group the time they need to arrive at a responsible and well-considered outcome, recognizing that the uncomplicated proposals from numbers and protocols communities are complete. This approach reinforces the U.S. government's commitment to multi-stakeholder outcomes during this critical time for internet evolution and internet governance. Our collective success depends upon a global, open, interoperable, trustworthy, and stable internet as a platform for the connected devices that Intel builds. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. We appreciate your testimony. We'll go now to Mr. Matthew Shears, the Representative and Director, Global Internet Policy and Human Rights Project, Center for Democracy and Technology. Mr. Shears, delighted to have you here with us today. We look forward to your comments.
Thank you. Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for your invitation to testify today. CDT has been deeply involved in the IANA functions transition process since the announcement by NTIA over a year ago. We recognize, as did NTIA and numerous other stakeholders, that this transition of stewardship over the domain name system was not only important in its own right, but would have significant consequences for international internet governance and the future of open, participatory, stakeholder-driven governance processes. I have had the pleasure of participating in the work of both the Working Group on the IANA transition of the domain names community, as well as the Working Group on enhancing ICANN's accountability. The IANA transition and ICANN accountability working groups are dealing with very complex challenges. Replacing the oversight role of NTIA is not a simple matter, nor is changing the governance structure of an organization, let alone one as unique as ICANN. Yet the global multi-stakeholder community, comprising businesses, governments, a technical community, civil society, academia, individual users, has risen to the challenge. Through my work in both working groups, it has become clear to me that these disparate stakeholders are united by shared goals: the continued stability, security, and resiliency of the DNS, and an IANA function that continues to operate in a neutral, fully accountable, and transparent manner. It also clear that this process could not have proceeded without the input of this broad cross-section of the global multi-stakeholder community and the range of technical, legal, and policy expertise that it brings. After many months of hard work, both the IANA transition and ICANN accountability proposals are now out for public comment. The two working groups have been working in parallel, but the issues they address are deeply intertwined. The Working Group on Enhancing ICANN's Accountability is focused on finding ways to empower the ICANN community, its supporting organizations and advisory committees, through increased oversight of ICANN processes and governance. These accountability reforms are also critical to the success of the IANA transition proposal. The current proposal for the IANA transition places the operation of IANA functions within a subsidiary of ICANN, thereby avoiding needing to create an external entity. In this proposal, ICANN will serve as the contracting entity for the IANA functions and the subsidiary as the operator. It's clear that for the proposal to work, ICANN, as the new IANA functions oversight body, must be held accountable so that it provides neutral and transparent oversight of the IANA functions. However, this will only be credibly possible with an ICANN community that is more empowered than it is today. It is therefore absolutely essential that the proposed accountability enhancements are embraced and committed to by ICANN and its board, both at the time of the transition and beyond. These community powers will also guard against capture and mission creep. The new accountability enhancements will make more explicit the narrow mission and purpose of the organization, and will make those delineations harder to change. New measures, including the ability to question budgets and strategic plans, will be key to keeping in check what ICANN does and how it fulfills its role in the Internet ecosystem. The community will be able to veto changes to bylaws, ensuring that neither ICANN's relationship to the IANA functions nor these important accountability reforms can be changed at the whim of the board, now or in the future. The community will be able to recall individual board members as well as the entire board, making the board members more directly accountable to the stakeholders that selected them. These powers will ensure that the leadership of ICANN remains responsive to the global community and does not take its role in the DNS for granted. The IANA transition is a culmination of a long-planned move to multi-stakeholder management of the DNS. The transition also supports the US government's commitment to multi-stakeholderism in international Internet policy, as my colleague Ms. Kale described. The NTIA's role in overseeing the IANA functions has been a major point of contention over the years. It will be increasingly hard to credibly refute the calls for a controlling role for governments in Internet governance if we do not complete a successful transition. To conclude, CDT expects and indeed is working hard to ensure that the global multi-stakeholder community will develop a transition proposal that satisfies NTIA's principles and stakeholder expectations, safeguards against capture or undue influence by stakeholders, and continues to maintain the stability, security, and resiliency of the DNS. The transition proposal must be accompanied by governance reforms that ensure the accountability of ICANN to the global community and that keep it closely tethered to its mission and mandate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shears. We appreciate your coming over here to share those comments with us. We now go to Brett Schaefer, who's the Senior Research Fellow in International Regulatory Affairs for the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Schaefer, delighted to have you before the subcommittee. Please go ahead with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, other distinguished members of the committee. Thank you very much for inviting me to testify here today. The history of the Internet is one of astounding innovation, growth, and success. A great contributing factor to the growth and success of the Internet is that formal governance and regulation has been light and relatively non-intrusive. Since 1998, the U.S. government has contracted with the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN, to manage most of the technical aspects of Internet governance, including the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, or the IANA function. This highly successful arrangement is about to change. As mentioned, in March 2014, the U.S. announced that it intended to end its historical relationship with ICANN. Although the timing of the announcement took many by surprise, the intent is consistent with long-standing U.S. policy to make management of the IANA fully private. This is a very important decision. When the U.S. government oversight role ends, ICANN will come under considerable pressure from a number of interested parties to adopt policies that they favor. It is critical that ICANN is sufficiently insulated from these pressures to make independent decisions, while simultaneously being responsive and accountable to the broader multi-stakeholder community. This is a very tough line to walk. Failure could lead to inefficiencies, instability, partiality, and other problems that could result in substantial costs and inhibit a vital medium for free speech and political discourse. There will be only one opportunity to do this, and it must be done right. I'm happy to say that, although much work remains to be done, I've been immensely pleased and impressed with the commitment and progress made to date. To coordinate multi-stakeholder recommendations, ICANN convened community-led working groups on stewardship and accountability to draft proposals for the transition. The working groups focused on technical aspects of the IANA transition have in particular made significant progress. The working groups the two teams focused on numbers and protocols submitted proposals in January that appear to have consensus support in the multi-stakeholder community. The third group focused on names has recently submitted a draft proposal for public comment. This proposal is more complex and creates a new governance structure within ICANN for the IANA. All three proposals would allow for separability, the ability to change to a different IANA functions operator if ICANN falls short in some way. This is a critical issue. The possibility that ICANN might lose the IANA contract with the U.S. government, however unlikely, has provided an independent check on ICANN's monopoly position. A key aspect of the stewardship discussion is focused on how to mirror that check after the U.S. role ends. According to some well-informed sources, ICANN is pushing back on separability. Congress needs to pay attention to this issue and clarify its position. The Accountability Working Group has also made great progress and has submitted a draft proposal for public comment. In my opinion, the paramount concerns that should be to ensure that 1, ICANN is sufficiently insulated against capture by governments or other narrow interests. 2, ICANN's purpose is narrowly defined to prevent mission creep. 3, an independent review process is in place to adjudicate and issue binding judgments over disputes between ICANN and the community. And 4, ICANN is responsive and accountable to the multi-stakeholder community by establishing a means for recalling the board, individual board members, approving the budget, and approving the strategic plan. As currently drafted, the accountability proposal addresses all of these concerns. However, sound ideas and intent can be thwarted by poor implementation, and we are far from the end of the process. The final issue I wanted to highlight is the tight time frame. Under the terms of the current contract with ICANN, the U.S. government will have to decide in just a few short months whether to allow the transition to proceed when the current contract expires on September 30th, 2015, or whether to extend the current contract to allow the transition proposals to be more fully developed and or implemented. As a practical matter, NTIA must have the details of the various proposed changes and evidence of their implementation well in advance of this date to make an informed decision on whether its conditions for the transition have been met satisfactorily. Looking at the hurdles, it must be clear there is very little chance that this deadline will be met. NTIA Administrator Lawrence Strickling and ICANN CEO Fadi Shahadi have both insisted and repeatedly stated that September 30th is not a goal or is a goal, not a deadline. In fact, there shouldn't be any deadline. Congress should hold them to the fact that this transition must be done correctly, not in any particular time or in any particular deadline format. Once NTIA's contract with ICANN expires, so does its ability to ensure changes considered necessary by the multi-stakeholder community are approved and implemented. Only after an acceptable transition proposal is offered and all the necessary reforms to ICANN are adopted and in effect should the U.S. end its current arrangement. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Schaefer, and I just want to say how much I agree with what you just said, and that's what my role certainly has been, and I think of our subcommittee here with these hearings, is I just want to know what it is that's going to govern this process once NTIA says, see you later, and all. And so I think we have an obligation as stewards of this to this point to make sure we know what the future looks like before we just say, oh, you go ahead and do it. So that's been the purpose behind all of our efforts, is just to find out what are the rules. And I want to commend those who have put so much time into this effort, because you've given us more and more confidence with each step of the way that you share our concerns here, and you're getting things locked into place where there is appropriate check and balance that otherwise goes away when that 60-some page contract is torn up. So my first question to each of you is, do you believe the transition could and or should occur by September of this year? And Mr. Schaefer, I think you've already said no.
That's correct. I don't think there's any way realistically that the
Okay.
transition can occur and all these changes will be implemented.
All right, Mr. Shears, yes or no?
I don't think it's likely to happen by that time, unfortunately.
All right, Ms. Plonk?
I think that decision and the plan lies with the multi-stakeholder community and not with me as an individual.
Ah, yeah, but you get to tell us. Just the same. Do
The
you think this can happen by September, given all the work you've put into this? That we're ready?
I think it depends on the outcome of the ICANN Buenos Aires meeting next month. I think we'll have more information then.
All right, that's fair. Ms. Kale?
I think it's unlikely, unfortunately, as well, to happen by September 30th, and getting it right is very important. But I also think the community does know, will be the one that knows best how much time it will take to get it done right.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Del Blanco?
The answer is no way, and the administration has been very realistic about it, has already sent letters to the naming and the accountability group chairs 2 weeks ago saying, how much time do you think you need? And I think that's appropriate. And the community is going to come back and ask for more time. As I indicated on that chart, it's a concurrent process. It stretches, and there's a role for Congress throughout. There's a role for NTIA throughout the process. Though there isn't this notion that moving that deadline, moving that goal out is somehow going to empower enemies of freedom and commerce. They already are enemies of freedom and commerce in any unique role for the U.S. I don't think that we need to worry about providing them an excuse if we end up asking for, in my estimation, I have April of 2016 is about the earliest we could get enough implementation done, but there are others who believe it could take as long as into the summer of 2016.
So then wouldn't it make sense for NTIA to extend the contract for another year? Just because, again, as I said in my testimony, they can cancel it if you get agreement. You can do that, but wouldn't it make sense to extend it?
I believe it does, Mr. Chairman.
Does anybody disagree with that, Ms. Kale? Ms. Plonk? Is that a yes or a no head shake?
I think I would just continue to say it's not, we haven't gotten a response from NTI's letters to the community
All
yet,
right.
so it's not clear.
Mr. Shears?
I think it's important that we understand and see what comes back from the community in terms of the consultations that are out at the moment on the two proposals. I think that's a key factor.
Mr. Schaefer?
I think it's very important for the NTIA to maintain its current role, at least as long as this process is still in play. Once the process is agreed to, and most importantly, all the necessary changes are actually implemented and verified, then is the time to end the current relationship.
Okay. So, Ms. Plonk, while we acknowledge there are potential benefits to this transition, we also have very serious concerns about the very real risks. I think everybody's spoken to that. Beyond simply trusting the international community to do the right thing, what do you see as the best way for Congress to get answers to the questions, and are there ways to address the potential pitfalls?
Thank you for the question. I think it's a really important one, and I absolutely agree with you that there are risks and potential pitfalls. Two main things. I think first I want to commend this subcommittee for actively participating in the process, for attending meetings, for showing up in Busan at the Plenipotentiary Conference, and for the amount of time the committee has invested to understanding that continued investment in the process will be a huge impact for the outcome. So I think that's one. The second is to continue to conduct oversight through having hearings like this one as we move through the process. And then the final point is to ensure that what NTIA accepts at the end is multi-stakeholder, is what has come out of the multi-stakeholder process, so that Congress is supporting its longstanding position on multi-stakeholder governance.
Mr. Del Bianco?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You asked the question, what's the best way for Congress to get answers? I'll give you two suggestions. The first is to get questions in now, as soon as possible. The GAO analysis generates questions and risks. Unanticipated risks and implications. And those risks, if we wait until the end of this process, Mr. Chairman, it will completely mess this process up. We need to hear about your concerns and risks this summer, over the next several months, and give us the opportunity to take care of your risks and concerns. And the second change is to find a way to give NTIA enough rope to spend time and resources answering your questions, for them to be the steward of getting you the answers that you need from the community, as well as for NTIA to assess whether the criteria are being met. It doesn't help us if NTIA waits till the very end to say thumbs up, thumbs down. There needs to be an engagement and involvement.
See, that's what we've been after, and that there's after you all do your work and the multi-stakeholder process does its work, give us a chance to at least look at it and understand it before handing the keys, the title, and the insurance payments off to the 18-year-old driver. With that, I thank you again for your testimony and your counsel along the way. Now recognize my colleague from California, Ms. Eshu.
Am I the 18-year-old that you're?
No, but
Oh,
Mr.
I
Del
thought you were
Bianco.
flattering me. Okay.
I was thinking more
All
like,
right, yeah.
17.
Well, at least it's not a sports analogy, so. Thank you. You are all enlightening. You really are. It's very, very helpful. Now, we've got a couple of things on the table here. You have described all of the work, and it's extensive work. And as the chairman said, and I join him in thanking you for the time that you've put in on this. I mean, this is an enormous amount of work that you've done, and it's productive, and it's bearing fruit. But we're not quite ready. And none of you think that, that the work is going to be accomplished by, what, September of this year? And all right. Now, we've got a couple of things on the, I think 3 things here. We have the .com Act in it. More work has to be done, but you're very pleased with what's on the table so far, and that Congress should continue to have to do its oversight in this. Now, if we get through this entire process and say the .com Act is law, then you have to go back to the GAO and have them study what is completed and what, wait another year? Do you all support that? Does this make sense to you, or do I have the wrong take on the legislation? I mean, it's my understanding that that it will add another year to what, John? John, let me just ask you, Mr. Shimkus? John, my pal.
Well,
Set it straight.
I was listening.
I'll yield to you for a second. When does your year begin? After they finish their process?
Right, but remember, GAO is already doing a report now, too.
I know.
So I
that's
think the timeline would be,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
there's almost
But
like
the
a parallel.
reclaiming my time, I mean, I think you just made my point. That's why I think it negates it, because if the GAO is doing something. Anyway, tell me what you all think of this. Do you think that this is a good plan? This is the way to go forward? I mean, just quickly, yes or no? Let's just start with Mr. Del Bianco.
The right
You're
plan
not
is-
going to be hurting anyone's feelings. I just
understood.
want
The right plan-
professional opinion.
Got it, thank you. The right plan is to take those risks and implications that you've asked for from GAO and surface those into the process. If, in fact, those risks are not addressed, it should not take anywhere close to a year to say, we raise these risks and concerns for national security and for other agencies, and they haven't been addressed. That could happen very quickly. But it's so important to have it while we are convened. If you wait for us to finish
Well, that's
and
my
generate
very
that
point.
document, it
To
won't
get
work.
to the end and then start all over again, I don't think is a good way to go. Do you have something, Ms. Kale?
I would agree with that. I think that the important thing here is engagement now in the process as it's ongoing, and that's one of the great things about the process is it's a multi-stakeholder,
It is.
transparent, and open process. So there is the opportunity now to look at and review what's happening. We know a lot of the risks, the stress
Go
tests that
quickly, my
exist are
time's
really
running out.
important.
So you're agreeing,
I
that's
would-
great.
Yes.
Ms. Plonk?
I also agree. I want to just also say that everything that's happening right now is completely transparent and open. So the final that transits from the ICG to ICANN to NTIA will not be a surprise to anyone who's been participating or anyone who hasn't. They can see everything that's happening.
I want to thank Intel for everything you do in our region and in my district. You're wonderful. Mr. Scheer?
Yes, I also agree, but I'd like to emphasize that now is the time for us to, as Steve said, for those results of that report to be revealed.
And
That's
Mr.
my-
Schaefer?
I don't think that there's 2 times. I think that Congress does have a very strong interest in this issue and in the process. I think it should voice its concerns and its priorities during this process. But I also think that it should, at the end of this entire process, take a moment, evaluate what is a final product, and then make a decision as to what's going on and whether it's meeting its own
So start all over again.
Yes.
That's what you're saying.
I don't think it requires a year, but I think it does need to be assessed at the end of
I
the
don't know.
process.
I think if we do our job, we don't need that time. That's the point. If we're thorough, both on our side of the dais and you on yours. Let me just raise something. We have another issue here, and that is in the Commerce Justice Appropriations Bill, which was released today. None of the funds made available by this act may be used to relinquish the responsibility of the NTIA with respect to Internet domain name system functions, including responsibility with respect to the authoritative root zone file and the Internet assigned numbers authority function. So we have appropriators getting into this as well. So I think that this is the subcommittee that needs to give guidance to all of this. You know, we've done a deep dive on it, and we will continue to because it requires it. I'm all for us, for this subcommittee to do that work. And I commit myself, and I know people on our side of the aisle. Boy, are you a distraction today, Pallone. Jeez, a whiz. Jeez, a whiz. Anyway, anyway, listen, I forgot my train of thought, but I think that the work has to keep going on. It needs to be intensive, broad, deep, and directed. We know what the mission is. We know what we need to accomplish, and Congress has to be part of that every step of the way. And I think if we do that, that the date that we finish is not the point. It will be that we did an excellent job on something that requires that kind of work. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlelady. And just for point of clarification, that's why we're having this hearing and why our staffs have been meeting.
I understand.
I think the original .com Act with a year deadline and all kind of preceded all of this, and that things have changed. And that's why they've been talking, and we've already got the GAO audit underway, well underway, and so I don't know that it needs to be a year at all, and I thought we had communicated that. So we look forward to working together. With that, I now recognize the Vice Chair of the committee, is that right? Down to the former Chair of the committee, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of our witnesses talked about giving the driver the keys, and you talked about who's paying for the insurance. My question is, who's going to police the road? Who's going to be there when something goes wrong? The best of drivers are going to run a stop sign or exceed the speed limit, and there are various kinds of insurance. Sometimes they pay, sometimes they don't. But if you don't have an enforcement mechanism, you're going to have chaos. And I've yet to hear this vaunted multi-stakeholder process come up with an enforcement mechanism. I've tried to think of international multi-stakeholder institutions. I can't think of one that I think works better or as well as, and I hate to say this, but the federal government. I wouldn't say the United Nations is a paragon of efficiency. I wouldn't say the International Olympic Committee. I wouldn't even say the World Bank. So somebody on this panel enlighten me. We've got a system that's not broke. It's the most open, transparent process out there. One of you talked about the internet doubling every 10 months. I've been all over the world on various congressional trips. The only place I've had trouble getting my laptop because it said the Chinese government was going to bug it if I tried to turn it on. So why try to change something that, to all intents and purposes, is one of the best multi-stakeholder, transparent, international processes out there that has the benefit of having an enforcement mechanism behind it, which is the ultimately the federal government. And I'll let anybody take a crack at that.
Mr. Barton, Steve Del Bianco, I think we missed misconnected on the earlier part of the testimony, but I described the new powers that we're proposing, because 17 years ago, when ICANN was set up, in their bylaws, they explicitly took away the ability for the community to actually police them. In other words, a corporation has to answer to its shareholders, who can spill their boards and pass resolutions. My members of my trade association hold me accountable, and I think your voters and citizens probably hold you guys pretty accountable too. None of that has existed for 17 years at ICANN. Instead, the community, the broad community, has to run to, well, Congress or NTIA to try to get a little leverage put on ICANN. We can sue ICANN, and many often do, and contract parties can take ICANN to court over what they're doing. I think that when you look at the testimony of what we've drafted so far, we're giving the community dramatic new powers that are more like those that a shareholder does or that a voter has. And I think that's how we'll police the road.
Anybody else?
Sure. Thank you. I think the first part of your question, the best analogy I can
I'm
draw
just using what was
Yeah.
given me. I mean, you
No,
know,
no. The
I'm better at sports analogies, actually.
I actually steal from a colleague who was on a panel earlier today, and he says the process isn't broken and doesn't necessarily need to be fixed. That's true. It's worked very well and it's been very successful. But the toothpaste is out of the tube, and this was said by Phil Corwin this morning. And what that means is that we've entered into a process that can't be reversed, and that if we try to reverse it, as mentioned by a couple other people on this panel, the very likely outcome is not that we're going to have the same situation in place going forward, but that the oversight of ICANN and the Internet is going to be taken over by the ITU or some other international organization, which would be a far, far less accountable, less efficient, and more susceptible to inimical pressures than the current one. And so I think we're far better off having ICANN be accountable to the multi-stakeholder community, which is in essence everybody who uses the Internet governing ICANN directly. And if, until that happens, however, we need to maintain the current oversight structure of NTIA and the U.S. federal government to make sure that ICANN does accept and abide by and implement those measures that have been outlined by Mr. Del
Look, my
Bianco
time's
down
about
at the
to
board.
I'm not opposed to this multi-stakeholder process, but you take things for granted. We've created a system that is the best in the world. It really works. But you do need some enforcement mechanism somewhere with credibility that can step in if they have to. And so far, with all respect, I don't see that. And that's my concern. But maybe it's out there and I just don't know it. But
I completely agree, Congressman, and you're right. It does not currently exist. That's what we're in the struggle to try and implement.
Ms. Plunk, did you want to respond?
I just wanted to add one thing. In addition to the various accountability measures that have been proposed that I think are very good, and my colleague Steve has outlined in fairly good detail in terms of an empowered community, how we overturn the board, how we overturn decisions. I think all that gets to your question of enforcement. But in addition, something that's come out of this process that we haven't talked about yet is the preponderance of evidence that supports U.S. rule of law and incorporation in the state of California. And the various legal analyses that have been done by the multi-stakeholder community puts forward just how favorable the U.S. as a jurisdiction is for this process. And I think the
it would be helpful if you're in the U.S. legal system. That is a plus.
Sharon, I could react to that.
Yeah, if you do it quickly, because we've got to move on to Mr. Pallone.
Yeah, the affirmation of commitments required in 8B that ICANN shall maintain a headquarters in California. That's a legal presence and a headquarters presence. That's in the affirmation of commitments, and as I said earlier, ICANN can walk away from that. So we've made it our mission to move any commitments from the affirmation into the bylaws. It turns out that one, 8B, is already in the bylaws. Article 18, Section 1 already says ICANN shall be principal offices, California, Los Angeles, California. So it's in the bylaws, and yet the board could change the bylaws. So another power we described is that the board tried to change the bylaws and leave California, leave any legal presence. We would have 75% of the community votes could block that change. Now, that may not be strong enough for some of the concerns that I think the GAO will surface on issues like national security. So we may have to turn it into a fundamental bylaw where 75% of the community would have to agree with it as opposed to oppose it.
Okay.
Make that Houston, Texas, and you got me.
Wow. All right, we've got to move on to Mr. Pallone now on the Democrat side.
Ms. Eshoo mentioned that this morning the House Appropriations Committee released the Commerce, Justice, and Science Appropriations Bill for fiscal year 16, and the draft bill is designed to prevent NTIA from using appropriated funds to complete the IANA transition. She actually read that. So my question is, what is the impact of this language on the continued success of the multi-stakeholder model of Internet governance? And do you think this language advances our interest in accountability and transparency into the transition process? I'd like to ask any of you to respond to that.
I could take a stab at it to suggest that NTIA operated under a rider over the past year, and while they're not relinquishing anything, they are heavily engaged at ICANN, because that's what you charge them to do. NTIA is supposed to be at ICANN. They're at all the meetings and engaged. And on March the 19th, we were in the middle of a hot debate with the governments over what to do about stress test 18. It was the first stress test that I articulated for you last year's hearing. This idea that the government could change to majority voting and suddenly be able to impose much of its will on ICANN. A handful of governments objected to that, but our government stood tall, sent a very powerful letter to say that if we don't make this change that we're recommending, we won't meet the conditions of NTIA's transfer. So instead of waiting to the end and saying voting no, engaged early. All it took was a little bit of a phone call and a nudge, and our Commerce Department stepped right up. So they are engaging. I don't think it's spending any extra money, Mr. Pallone, because I think these are people that are on salary, right? But they're spending money to help us decide how to shape this transition, which is not the same thing as relinquishing control. So I guess it all depends on how the rider is written.
Well, did you want me to read it to you again? It says, none of the funds made available by this act may be used to relinquish the responsibility of the National Telecommunications and Information Administration with respect to Internet domain name system functions, including responsibility with respect to the authoritative root zone file and the Internet assigned numbers authority functions.
So it sounds as if Commerce could work as hard as they could to help get your questions answered and test the conditions, but they couldn't take the final act of letting go of the contract. Is that an appropriate way to interpret it?
I'm asking you. I don't know.
I'm not an expert on expert on this.
All right. Anybody else want to respond?
If I may, I think it would be a great shame if things got in the way of the multi-stakeholder process in coming forward with a proposal. If a proposal is ready and there are further delays through other mechanisms, I think that would be a shame. And that would really undermine the multi-stakeholder model and approach. Thanks.
Ms. Planck?
Thank you. Just to further my colleagues' comments, I think we would view that as an externally imposed or mandated delay, which, as I said in my testimony, we also believe would undermine the multi-stakeholder process.
Okay. Anyone else?
I would just echo that and say that I think it's a lose-lose proposition in a lot of ways, because although the intent may be to make sure that this transition is handled well, it will make it harder in some ways, I think, for NTIA. We want them to be very engaged in this process, and we want to send a message that we support it. And I think the concern about the message that this sends is also very important, that this idea that it is some sort of attempt at an external delay in the process. So I don't think it advances our interests.
Mr. Schaefer?
Actually, I think that's my interpretation of it is a sense of frustration on the part of Congress that its voice is not being heard or perhaps being respected in the way that they want it to be. The NTIA has insisted that there is not a role for Congress here, that it has the authority to do this, and Congress has responded to that with this legislation. And I think a proper way to do this would be for NTIA to say that they're not going to make any decision without consulting with Congress and involve it directly in the process, and for Congress to voice its concerns directly and clearly to the NTIA, also to the ICANN and to the multi-stakeholder process, what it considers to be vital and key priorities for its, to resolve its concerns.
Oh, thanks. Let me just ask quickly, not all of you can respond, but I understand that ICANN will be meeting next month in Argentina, where many of the issues we're discussing today will be on the table. What progress are you hoping to see in Buenos Aires next month, if anybody wants to take a stab at that?
We'll have the results of the consultations on the two proposals. So there will be a significant input from the community, from the multi-stakeholder community, beyond ICANN, and that will shape the two proposals going forward. So that will be a significant issue for two significant areas of work for us in Buenos Aires.
Anybody else? 5 seconds? No? All right. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome, of course. And I think this does speak to why we need to come to terms as we're working together on this legislation because of the frustration some members have. They'll go to the PROPS route if we don't do our job. So I appreciate, I'm aware of that. I'm aware of that. I'm aware of that. So that's why we're having this hearing and why our staffs have been talking about if we could find common ground, we might be able to move forward with legislation that the administration could support and we could show strong support out of this committee. With that, we'll go to Mr. Latta, the Vice Chair of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks very much for our witnesses again for being here today. I tell you, this is a very, very good hearing today, and I think it's bringing up a lot of very good information we have to have as we go forward as a committee and as a House. But one of the first questions I'd like to ask Mr. Del Bianco, if I could ask of you, and there's 3 parts to this question, and the question is this. One proposal from ICANN Accountability Working Group is the creation of a fundamental bylaws as a mechanism for the multi-state community. Can you elaborate on how you think this is going to help improve the accountability? And then maybe just follow right up into this is, do you think that this will work long term? And is there enough of a culture of accountability within the membership of the community to make this effective? So really starting with that question about the fundamental bylaws.
Thank you, Mr. Latta. The bylaws that exist at ICANN today are all subject to change by the Board of Directors without any input at all from the community. They get to make the final decision to change bylaws. That's been unacceptable. That's not accountability at all. So the 2 powers that are embedded in the proposal that we've been discussing. The first power is that the community, with a 75% vote, can block a board proposed bylaws change. And a lot of this is make sure that we lock in the powers that we have. Although we believe that there are certain bylaws that are more important than others, that are fundamental and critical. So for those, just flip it on its head. For those, if the board wanted to change the bylaw, it's a fundamental bylaw, the community would have to agree by a 75% vote of these members. And we have a laid out structure on who gets to vote and how. And if the community doesn't get 75% agreement, the bylaw does not change. So one of the debates is, should this California principal office be a fundamental bylaw or not? And it would be so helpful to get comments from members and from this committee, from the Congress, on that particular question, because it's before us over the next several weeks. You also asked if the community has a sufficient culture of accountability. The community is people like us, and we all are used to holding institutions accountable in our daily lives. It's when we go to ICANN that we sort of give all that up. So I hope that we can rely upon that cultural accountability that we have and start to fire those engines when we start to work at ICANN. But it will take a few years probably for us to learn how to exercise the muscle of all these new powers we've designed.
Mr. Speaker, let me ask you, because this is interesting, and you know, as we've seen through time and across the world, sometimes things don't actually work sometimes the way we hope they would, especially when we're talking about the multi-stakeholders and the oversight. The question I'm going to ask is this: could there be some intimidation by certain members of other members that would be a problem out there, that you'd end up on an intimidation when we're talking about trying to change bylaws or just the functioning of the board itself?
I'm sorry, who are you addressing the question to?
If you could answer that.
Oh, sure. Anything's possible, of course. Other members can bring pressure on other board members, but inside the reforms as outlined by Mr. Del Bianco and the accountability group, individual members of the board would be susceptible to recall by their constituencies in there, and also
But suppose that some of these are more authoritarian type governments, and this is one of the things that we've talked about in this committee,
Sure.
that you know, they wouldn't be recalled by their constituency because there is no constituency.
Well, the constituencies on the ICANN board aren't representative of governments. They're representative of parts of the community and various stakeholder groups and advisory committees. So I'm not exactly sure.
But you don't think that, but I guess the really question that I've got, though, is that can there be intimidation of those stakeholders out there And there's going to be, and it might not just be because of what we're talking about on the internet, because of other things that are going on in the world and different things a lot of things that this committee touches that we've seen that can happen. But my fear is that you could have some folks out there that would be intimidated, not by quote unquote a government, but by the stakeholders that are representing a government.
That would require a significant amount of coordination and pressure among a great deal of people and great deal of constituencies that I think would be very difficult to either conceal and do so in a secretive fashion. The nature of the multi-stakeholder community is that it's very diverse. It encompasses a broad array of individuals and organizations and businesses and so forth, and I think it would be very hard to do that unless you're talking about criminal activity, and then that would be something that would be handled by law enforcement, not through the accountability measures established under ICANN.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my time's expired. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Chair
Testimony, you mentioned that for the proposed governance structure of IANA to work, that ICANN must ensure it's accountable to the broader community of stakeholders. Have you seen ICANN take steps to empower the broader community in such a way as to enable this greater accountability, or what concerns still remain?
One of the things that's certainly true is that this community within ICANN has been crying out for greater accountability and transparency for some time, and this came to a head last summer, and that was one of the reasons for this accountability working group going forward. So the work that group is doing at the moment is the work that we hope we'll see implemented at the same time as the transition takes place. So to date, I think it's fair to say, as others have said on the panel, that the accountability and transparency at ICANN has not been as good as it could have been, and in sometimes inadequate, and that this is our opportunity to make sure that those changes are put into place, and it's essential that they are.
Yeah, and you mentioned one source of accountability is for the community to be able to award the IANA contract to another entity down the road. Do you see this as an effective check towards improving ICANN's governance and accountability?
It's an absolutely essential check, yes.
Yeah. Ms. Kell, in your testimony, you said that had NTIA not voluntarily undertaken this transition, that other stakeholders would have moved forward. Tell us how U.S. leadership in this transition-driven, how U.S. leadership has driven stakeholders to the table, and what will be the consequences if we have delays?
Of course, thank you for the question. So I think from the very beginning, actually from 1998, the U.S. has been a tremendous leader in bringing these stakeholders to the table and empowering the system to work from the beginning. I think we saw in October of 2013, which is what I mentioned in my testimony, the heads of the regional internet registries and ICANN and the Internet Engineering Task Force, put out a statement calling for the globalization of ICANN and the transfer of the IANA function, saying it's time. And so I think the response of the U.S. government to say, yes, it's time and we can initiate this transition was both, it was appropriate historically, it made sense politically, and as a result, we are in a strong position right now still to set the terms here. So we're a leader. We're not saying that this is going to be dragged from us kicking and screaming in any way. We're not saying that we're trying to delay it. We're saying it's time, we support this system, and we trust that we can figure out a way working with the community to actually make it happen. I think that is it's an incredibly powerful message for the U.S., and I think on the other side of that, if we don't do that, there is this concern that this political target, this sort of like falsely clouds our good intentions in the internet governance space, will only grow larger, right? So this idea that this is something that comes up, it's for the past more than a decade, it comes up at internet governance meetings, it comes up, it came up in Korea at the International Telecommunication Union conference, this idea that this was a problem and that this somehow privileged the U.S. role. And so it's the responsible thing to do to say, we're going to end that, and we're going to do this in a manner that works for both us and for the global internet community.
Great. Would either of you like to add anything to that, Ms. Plunk or Mr. Shears? Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'll just close by saying that I want to keep it in Los Angeles, California, but not Houston, Texas. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back his time, and Chair recognizes myself for 5 minutes, and it's great to have you. And I think we are making progress from my colleagues on the other side. I don't think we'd be in this position had the original bill not been dropped in the last Congress. And in respect to the appropriation battle, I would argue that we wouldn't even have that fight had we done a better job of working together last Congress to try to raise these issues. Because if you remember this whole debate, and Mr. Strickland was one of them, and many of you were there, Congress has no role. That's what your statements were. Congress has no role. Now today you're saying what? There is an important role for us to play. And we need to be involved because our citizens are going to ask questions. The world is a much different place now than it was in 2012. So where decisions were made in 2012, we're at a different place. I think there's less trust in the international world and community right now just because of world events. So you have to, we just represent people, okay? In our districts, we all have about 750,000 of what we're doing with NTIA. So as much as we have to respect the work that they're doing, they have to respect the work that we're doing. And so, I do appreciate my colleagues. I think we're going to move in a process that I'm hopeful that we'll have comfort that there is legislative role. I would yield to my colleague.
For a few seconds. I appreciate what you said, and Congressman Shimkus and I have worked on a lot of issues together very successfully over the years, so I appreciate what you said. I think where perhaps we weren't totally on the same side was having confidence in a multi-stakeholder community, that model could work. I don't ever remember myself questioning whether Congress shouldn't lean in or anyone from our side, but that's the past. We're moving on, but I still think it's worth saying for the record, and we're going to work with you because we realize how important this is. And for the amount of time that these people have invested is really glorious. And you should really be very proud of yourselves because I think you're the ones that have really moved the ball down the field and said that to the Congress, and now the Congress is feeling far more confident. So thank you for yielding, Mr. Chairman.
I'm happy to do so. And let me raise a couple issues. I did submit this column for the record in the opening statements, and it just raises one of the issues. And as we go through this process, what are the concerns out there? And I have so many questions. I've been scribbling notes down through the whole hearing. But I guess the bottom line is, how, when we have the NTIA have what their listed objectives are, the question will then be, what is missing, and your advice and counsel could be helpful, what should be added to give us certainty. But for example, in the article it says, consider the importance of .mil, which is sponsored by the United States Department of Defense. It houses some of the secure systems and email addresses most vital to U.S. national security. Using them would place a considerable strain on nation's defenses, yet the Pentagon has no ongoing contractual right to it. The Department control over .mil is a legacy arising out of America's invention of the World Wide Web. And they also mention .gov and .edu as a concern. Does anyone reject the premise of that statement, Mr. Del Bianco?
Thank you, Mr. Shimkus. No, it's of vital importance. Think about what would happen. Think about the risks if our .mil and .gov were under attack or redirected during an emergency, maybe a coordinated attack that went after cyber structure and infrastructure. And it's in particularly different for us. For 100 countries around the world, their .gov lives at the second level, .gov.ca for Canada, .gov.uk. Since it lives at that level, it's on a server on their soil, completely under their control and law. .mil is the root server, and it ought to maintain a U.S. presence for that reason. Now, we can get a contract with ICANN so that the U.S. DOD and GSA have permanent custody of those names, but that contract wouldn't be worth the paper it's printed on if ICANN left the U.S. as a legal presence and if the root left our shores.
Yeah, and I'll end on this. My time's expired. I'll just say, I'm curious to the contractual obligations and NTIA's role and where would people go? I mean, I think we weave a story that people will flee. I'm not sure there's any other organized structure in which they would go to. So with that, I'd like to recognize for 5 minutes Mr. Lujan for questions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much, and thank you for this important hearing today. And, Mr. Chairman, I just want to say this at the start. As we make this transition, we must ensure that we must make every effort to ensure that the foundational values of the Internet, freedom of expression and protection from government interference, are preserved. I think that's a value that we all share. And, Ms. Plunk, as I'm sure that you're aware, for years Intel has been an important partner in New Mexico. And we certainly appreciate your presence, and we're always open to opportunities to talk about expansion. And so I just wanted to lay that out with my good friend, Mr. Walden, that's also here. I know that we're always talking about opportunities at Intel in our various states and our various districts as well, but we really appreciate you being here. And as an important partner who shares a very important perspective with what Intel does, not only in this space, but being the only presence in the United States in what you do. And we have to acknowledge that. One, to make sure that we're doing our part to protect that industry and to provide opportunities for expansion. But can you explain further why you support this transition and how it impacts your business?
Thank you for the question and for the kind remarks about Intel. We're building a new universe of connected devices, the Internet of Things, wearables, what have you. All of these devices are not very valuable to people unless they can connect. And so our business interest is in seeing the Internet grow. I mentioned in my testimony the rates in which we've experienced growth for the last 30 years. It's going to need to continue to grow exponentially to meet the demands for all of the connectivity, for all of the devices that we're building silicon to support. So we're concerned that, well, we support the transition because we think that's the best path to growth at the end of the day. We're concerned about anything that would deviate from the path toward growth of the Internet, such as fragmentation. Should countries decide to split off from a global Internet in a way that we couldn't do business as easily across borders, where the benefit of the platform for expression and for interoperability wouldn't exist, at least in the way we know it today. All of those are huge drivers for not just Intel, but the IT and internet community that, as I mentioned in my testimony, grew up in the United States and to a large degree is headquartered here. So I think that's our fundamental business interest. And so that's why we support the transition, and we're positive in the outlook of what we think is to come. My colleagues, all of my colleagues here have been deeply involved in the process. Mr. Del Bianco has detailed out the accountability reforms. Mr. Shears has as well. So we're optimistic about the outcome, about the outlook for the future, and it's very critical to us.
And Ms. Plunk, your testimony discusses the challenges the U.S. faces in building international support for the multi-stakeholder model as well. You note that some countries advocate for centralized control of the Internet or a greater role for international organizations like the UN. What would be the impact on companies like Intel if these voices were to prevail and we abandoned the successful multi-stakeholder approach?
If we were to completely abandon the multi-stakeholder processes that we know today, I don't know that anybody at this table would be able to participate going forward. A one country, one vote system, such as at the UN, doesn't allow for direct participation from the private sector or civil society. We would be having to work through governments and national governments. We wouldn't necessarily have the direct relationship that we have with ICANN to represent ourselves. So that's, I think, the short answer to the impact.
And I guess the follow-up to that, just straight to the point, is when taking into account the stakeholder international opinion, does the United States advocacy for a multi-stakeholder model free of government control strengthen or weaken Internet access and freedom for users in states like New Mexico?
I think the multi-stakeholder system allows the U.S. government to engage in representing the country, representing the people, just the way that you do here in Congress. And the multi-stakeholder system also allows users to represent themselves directly, whether that's through participation in civil society organizations or in trade associations, through their businesses. However, they have access directly, as well as through the U.S. government representing them.
Thank you, and I thank you and all the witnesses for making yourself and your expertise available to us today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Lance, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon to you all, and it's a pleasure to be with you. Mr. Del Bianco, you've emphasized the need to stress test various proposed ICANN reforms, and I certainly agree with that, and you have not suggested such tests for the technical operations of the domain name system. Can we assume that this is because they have not been tested in a real-world setting for quite some time?
Thank you, Mr. Lance. We have 26 stress tests. 4 of them do address core naming functions, change failure, redelegation failure, compromise of DNSSEC credentials, as well as dotless domains and innovations of that nature. So, but in each case, the proposed planning that we talked about, the powers, give the community and the direct naming customers the power to do escalation procedures on failures, as well as the ability for us to challenge decisions that were made or inaction of ICANN. So the proposed community powers enable what we need there, but beyond that, we had no call to do stress testing of the underlying technical operation at the core of the internet, because tech services at that level, those companies, they've actually been doing it for decades with, and they're tested every single day, I think, with stress tests of real world operation.
Thank you. And Ms. Plonk, you're nodding your head. I'd certainly be interested in your comments.
Accountability over ICANN itself.
Thank you. To the panel in general, whoever would like to respond, in your experience, what is the international perception of the U.S.'s role in the operations and oversight of the Internet? Is there a solution that is acceptable to the international community without risking the future of the Internet? Mr. Shears.
Thank you. This is a wonderful question because when we talk
I didn't write it, the staff wrote it, so...
When we talk about the multi-stakeholder model, that does involve governments. So governments are, and governments from different countries around the world are represented in these discussions that we're having, so they are fully apprised of what's happening on accountability, and they're fully apprised of what's happening on the IANA transition. So yes, there is a considerable amount of support. There are, of course, the naysayers, and this is to be expected, but there is a considerable amount of support for the transition around the globe.
Thank you. Others on the panel who might wish to comment? Yes.
Thank you. I would add, I think that historically there has been a lot of, I think that the key is that in recent years, the sort of erosion of the trust in whether we could continue to be that neutral steward or whether we needed to be has been quite effective. And so I think that's why we're at the point now where there isn't a way to put the toothpaste back in the tube. We can't go back on the promises that we've made. And so the solution that we come up with has to be one that recognizes that while, without sort of diminishing the important role that the U.S. government has played, that it's time to move on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Mr. Lance, I might add that the international perception comes down to how we interact, and I say we as Americans,
yes.
Because on every working group, at every ICANN meeting, there are more often than not more Americans than any other group. Sometimes Americans might be more than the rest put together. It's because countries don't have the same kind of presence of companies like Intel. So there's a dominant presence of Americans, and we conduct our business at ICANN primarily in English. The second is there's a precedent here. The laws of the state of California have served us very well. And while others from around the world chafe when we talk about maintaining that fundamental bylaw for California presence, it's not as if anybody has stepped up with a better idea and a better place to take it. So there's a grudging acknowledgement that we built it and have an awfully good system in place, but it kind of bothers them that we are probably more dominant than we otherwise should be.
Well, thank you very much, and California is a great state. I yield back 17 seconds.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate all of you being here and spending some time with us today, and I know you'll be ready to go when that time comes too. But there's been some debate in the multi-stakeholder community over whether ICANN should be permanently granted stewardship of the IANA functions as a condition of the transfer. It seems some believe that in order to keep ICANN accountable to the community, there should be some mechanism to replace them. Mr. Shears, what are your arguments being made in regards to this issue?
Yes, certainly CDT does not support ICANN having the IANA operations in perpetuity. We believe that being able to select another operator is a core accountability mechanism that keeps the IANA functions neutral, transparent, and accountable themselves. And that's probably one of the most important aspects in terms of the package as a whole, the overall proposal.
Ms. Plonk, your written testimony, you also addressed this issue. Would you mind elaborating on it a little bit?
I support the comments by Mr. Shears that the ability to choose another operator through termination clauses as is standard in contracts, certainly in the U.S. and in California, is normal and should be a criteria for moving forward.
Somebody else on the panel want to address it at all? Or? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Kinzer. I agree that we need to be able to reassign those IANA functions of names, protocols, and numbers. But when it comes to what ICANN does, the policy-making part, it's a huge policy-making machine. It's signed thousands of contracts, and it has to enforce the contracts. I don't think dumping that makes much sense. But what does work is if ICANN's not doing that job well, we'll dump the board. We'll get a new board rather than a new entity to do the policy making.
Okay. Anybody else wanted to address that at all? Yeah.
Just to follow up, I appreciate Mr. Del Bianco's clarification that there is this separation between the policymaking function that ICANN has and the execution of the IANA functions, which are largely administrative.
Okay.
If I might add,
Yeah, please.
one thing. It's in my testimony, I make reference to a article and several statements by Mr. Woodcock, who's part of the CRISP group, and also commentary by Milton Mueller, who is instrumental in the stewardship process as well. And they give some evidence, or at least stories of ICANN resisting the separability process, and I think that's something that is, as mentioned on the panel, very important to the accountability and the long-term interests of this process. And in that discussion, they indicated that some individuals at ICANN had said that Congress was opposed to separability as part of this process. If that is the case, and we don't know whether it is or not, this is, again, a story, Congress should, I think, step forward and clarify whether it is or whether it is not opposed to this as part of the process. And I think, based on what I've seen and what I've heard in discussions, that Congress is indeed not opposed to this, and in many cases is supportive of this process and should state so.
And one proposal from ICANN Accountability Working Group is to significantly change the appeals process for ICANN review. Can any of you elaborate on whether or how you think this will help improve accountability? And is there a better or more effective way of achieving the goal of accountability?
Mr. Kinzinger, it's just one of the new powers we are granting, but I'll just focus on it since you asked. But the independent review process has been pretty inaccessible for many aggrieved parties. It's phenomenally expensive. It's as much as $1 million to hire counsel to pay the panelists that are pulled together for the independent review panel. There's a limited scope of matters that can be taken up, and it's very difficult for a broader community of aggrieved people to have standing as a group. So we are relying upon some very smart lawyers, not working for ICANN, but working for the community, to dramatically improve the independent review process. We call that the crown jewel of our powers. We're going to make it more accessible, and if it's the community that filed the independent review, ICANN will pay for the panelists, not the community. We wouldn't be able to scrape that together. They have to use the standard of review that's baked into these newly improved bylaws, so the standard of review will be known, which includes a tight limitation on ICANN's scope creep. And then finally, when the decision comes back from the independent review panel, we are seeking to ensure that it is a binding decision on ICANN that will force them to do over a decision that the community has rejected.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I only have 10 seconds left, so I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the panel's testimony today as well. One of my greatest concerns with this transition is the susceptibility of the ICANN to manipulation by foreign governments. Mr. Delbancio, I'm sorry, I'm mispronounced. How will stakeholders protect the process from foreign governments if they continually push for power or unjust control once the United States withdraws its stewardship role?
Thank you, Mr. Bilirakis. This was one of the stress tests we discussed in front of your committee last April, and it is a genuine concern that governments together would exert more influence over ICANN without actually having reached consensus. Today, the Government Advisory Committee, or GAC, operates under its own self-imposed rule of consensus before it offers formal advice to ICANN. And when they offer formal advice at ICANN is strongly presumed to be following the advice. And when it doesn't follow the government advice, ICANN has to enter a period of trying to find a mutually acceptable solution with the Government Advisory Committee. No other advisor stakeholder group has that kind of due deference with ICANN. I think it's a recognition of the power of governments. So many governments have said they'd prefer to change to majority voting. It's a little messy to get consensus, and they'd like a majority, and I have to express the concern about that. Sometimes there are only 60 or 70 countries at a GAC meeting. If you can scrape together 34 votes for an oppressive new policy that gets in the way of free expression, that would be bad. So we have made a change to the bylaws as part of our proposal that we only have to give that due deference to the government advice if it is actually supported by consensus.
Thank you, Mr. Del Bianco. I got it right that time. Next question. A number of U.S. companies, including yours, Ms. Planck, have expressed support for this transition to
process in much the same way that they do today through the Government Advisory Council to ICANN. As well as the various communities within the United States, business, civil society, and academia will have as much, if not more, access to provide accountability for both the execution of the IANA functions, but also the overall policymaking role that ICANN has. So I view it as a very positive
What about
thing for the
congressional
U.S.
oversight?
So you will continue to have oversight over NTIA and their work on this issue as they will continue to participate in the multi-stakeholder process. I don't see dramatic changes in that regard.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
Will the gentleman yield? Mr. Bilirakis?
Yes, yes.
But it's not, we will lose the authority or the oversight that we have today. I mean, it's not fair to say, it's just be the same thing. Yeah, there is a definite shift, Mr. Del Bianco. There's a definite shift.
You're absolutely correct. I mean, a hearing like this would perhaps still happen post-transition, but the audience for your hearing is not going to be ICANN. The audience would be our NTIA, and we are one country's vote among the 100 so votes that are on the GAC. There's no special role anymore for the inventor of the
and that's all the point I was trying to make. I'll yield back to Mr. Bilirakis.
Okay, thank you.
There's no voting on the GAC, though, just to make that point.
One other thing I would just emphasize, there's nothing stopping individual members of Congress or Congress as a body from submitting comments to various proposals or any other changes through the comment process at ICANN. In fact, it could do so right now. And that is actually something I would think that Congress would be interested in engaging in during this process while this is all going on, and that would continue to be an avenue in the future.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Shears, in the past, some have argued that through relinquishing our contractual relationship with ICANN, accountability might suffer in the transition. In your testimony, you mentioned the current hybrid proposal of separating functions and oversight. You conclude by saying this can work only if ICANN is held accountable to its own internal governance structures, and stress the multi-stakeholder community needs to be more empowered than it is today for it all to work. Can you elaborate on this, and if you expect this approach to ensure accountability will be successful?
Yes, thank you. So the current model that is part of the IANA transition does foresee that ICANN is the contractor and a subsidiary of ICANN is the operator of the IANA functions. So in order for that to work, as I said in my testimony, it's absolutely essential that the oversight of the IANA operator is absolutely neutral and transparent and accountable. For that to be the case, it means that the community needs these additional powers that we're talking about, because at the moment those powers don't exist. So at the end of the day, to hold ICANN true and to ensure that that oversight exists over the IANA operator, we need these accountability measures that we've been talking about in this hearing.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair will now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Delianco, back to you. One proposal from the ICANN Accountability Working Group is the incorporation of the agreements made between ICANN and NTIA and the affirmation of commitments into the governing documents of ICANN. Can you elaborate for us on whether or how you think this will help improve accountability?
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. The affirmation of commitments was really an outstanding piece of work by the USA in 2009, and it came up with a set of principles that ICANN had to commit to, as well as reviews it had to commit to allow the community to perform. But these commitments were between ICANN and the U.S. government. It's a bilateral agreement. It's exactly the kind of thing that the IANA contract was. It would be the next target for elimination by governments around the world who don't want us to have a unique role. And that's why the very first stress test that it presented to this committee last April was ICANN, if they were to cancel the affirmation of commitments, we would lose all of that. So this working group spent a good deal of time, it occupies about 15 pages in our proposal, of bringing over all of the relevant commitments from ICANN, and we improved them as we brought them over. And then we took a look at the reviews that are done and gave the community more power to set who's on the review teams, to sunset old reviews, create new ones, and to more appropriately hold the board accountable to the recommendations. So I hope that, that your reading of our proposal will concur that we've done, I think, an adequate job of bringing all of the key commitments from the affirmation into the bylaws.
Okay, all right. Another question for you then. Another proposal from the ICANN Accountability Working Group is greater power to the constituent communities within ICANN, particularly in regards to the group's budget, operating plans, bylaws. In addition, the community would be able to approve changes to the fundamental bylaws and remove members of the ICANN board. Can you share your thoughts on whether or how you think this will improve accountability?
Those 5 powers are simply essential, and they stop short of that 5th one of spilling the board. That's seen as the nuclear option, not the option that would operationally be very useful, but each of those interim steps are amazingly lacking today. The community has no ability to block a budget, a strat plan, no ability to block a board-approved bylaws change. And so the idea of building these powers in came very clearly to the community through a series of public comments that were conducted last summer right after NTIA made this announcement. So it was very easy to gather a consensus of what powers the community needed. And they're all there with the intent of being sure that we keep ICANN's management and board, which is really accountable to the fiduciary concerns of the corporation, to keep them from going off the rails. So I think we're going to be able to answer your question with a yes.
Okay, well, good. Final question for you. Are there better or more effective ways of achieving accountability that I haven't talked to about here? You got about 2 minutes to tell me some others if you'd like to.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. So far, and I would happily yield to other panelists, but so far the proposals are complementary. They're not competing proposals. There's a complementary set of proposals on the naming and protocols and numbers, and there's the accountability proposal. That's that big second blue bar. And the reason it starts a lot later than the first blue bar is that ICANN management and board didn't want to admit that there needed to be a conversation about accountability. So a lot of this was over the objections of ICANN, but now we are all on board and we're all participating. As for other measures of, if I were to start over and invent the next ICANN, and it's like when you ask an Irishman for directions and he said, well, I wouldn't start from here. It's not possible, I think, to accommodate all of the disruption it would take to tear up and rearrange all of the contracts that are written with all the registries and registrars, all of the arrangements, the policy making, the compliance bureau. So we really don't think we need to start over with a new model, with a new ICANN. We want to give new powers to the community to hold ICANN accountable to its mission.
Okay, well, great. Mr. Chairman, I yield back a whole 46 seconds.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Long, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And K-E-H-L, how are we pronouncing that?
Like the vegetable, kale?
Kale, okay, that's what I thought it was. Okay, Kale. I thought I heard that earlier, but I don't always hear things correctly. But Ms. Kale, what if the transition doesn't go through? What's the downside?
I think the downside if the transition doesn't go through is the risk that there is immense pressure on this to happen in some other way without the U.S. government's ability to set the terms, right? So this idea that the wheels were in motion from other organizations to try to find from other parts of the community, sorry, not other organizations, to try to make this happen. So to say, well, we reach consensus and try to force the U.S. government's hand. There is the risk that there have been governments that have tried to bring this into the International Telecommunication Union, which is a body of the United Nations. When we were I was a member of the U.S. delegation in South Korea in October, and when we were there, that was something that came up. I think because of the existence of ICANN and the ongoing process, that was not a serious proposal, but those proposals will be strengthened if the transition doesn't go through. And I think the other risk, while I think this is not a nearly as likely one, is that you end up with the system fragmenting. You end up with multiple competing sources of authority because other people start to say we want to take this away, and that almost happened in the 90s before the U.S. government decided to do this. So that risk that it fragments, and then that this system that works very efficiently and very well that we can all, most people don't even know exists, suddenly doesn't work, right? And so that's a huge concern as well. I think that's a very unlikely scenario, but it is a possibility if we sort of continue down, if we don't resolve this and we go down this alternative path.
Say that again now. That on that last part, it's unlikely that what happened.
It's unlikely that the system would fragment, that you'd end up with multiple competing sources of authority. But if you did, the consequences would be incredibly significant.
As they say, there's many a slip between the cup and the lip. So if during this handoff, isn't there some chances of some pretty bad things happening also?
I think there are risks. There are risks that, again, that something fragmented or that the DNS could be used, the domain name system, as leverage to impose other policies or to expand ICANN's role. And that's where I think, that's why I said the heart of this is the accountability process and this idea that we have checks and balances to deal with ICANN's authority, and also this concept of enumerating the powers, and so making it very clear that ICANN's mandate is narrow, it's technical. Their job is to make sure that the system runs and that it works, that it doesn't fragment, and that most internet users don't know it exists.
Anyone want to dispute what she said? I saw a lot of head nodding in agreement. Anybody dispute what? Yes, sir, Mr. Shears.
Yes, thank you. I think one of the other things, the reasons why this transition is so important is because we're living the multi-stakeholder model right now in these working groups.
Can you pull your mic a little closer?
Sorry. We're living the multi-stakeholder model right now. These working groups are multi-stakeholder and they're working very well. For the transition not to occur would undermine that commitment that the U.S. government has to multi-stakeholder model and international internet policy issues. And I think that would be a damaging blow to the legitimacy of the model as a whole. So that's another consequence of this transition not going ahead.
Schaefer.
I agree with the assessment there. There's been a concerted effort by a number of countries to try and shift authority away from the United States and ICANN into the international model, the multilateral model, ITU or other forums over the years. The U.S. has successfully pushed those back. The expectation now is so high that it's very unlikely that we can get away with not proceeding down the path toward the transition to our private sector overseeing or withdraw from the U.S. oversight of ICANN. But one thing I will say is that we need to be very careful not to go down and agree to a transition proposal that is substandard just because we fear something else worse might come along. I think the United States needs to be very clear about what is and what is not acceptable and hold to that line, because a substandard proposal could be just as bad as the other outcome.
Well, shouldn't .mil, .gov, shouldn't those be exclusive, perpetual, and at no cost? Are we going to be able to do that?
Mr. Del Bianco talked about that a little bit earlier. I believe that the United States should make conditional on the transition its exclusive ownership of those two TDLs.
You believe what now?
That the United States should make, as a condition of the transfer, its ownership of those two.
Yeah, I heard what Mr. Del Bianco said earlier, but I just wanted to kind of figure out how to tie it into what you were saying. So with that, I don't have any time to yield back, but if I did, I would.
Gentleman's time expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Collins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been interesting as we've kind of deep dived this issue to jump in. This would be your chance to take an extra 4 minutes as we're summing up to see if on the record you'd like to bring something up that we in Congress should be concerned about, worried about, or should take action on. And so why don't we maybe start with Mr. Del Bianco and see if you've got something to add here as we conclude.
One of the concerns is keeping ICANN to its limited technical mission. So we have proposed a change to their fundamental bylaws to say that, quote, ICANN shall not undertake any other mission not specifically authorized in these bylaws. So it's a much tighter rein to put on it. And the importance of that making it through cannot be understated. We need to be sure that ICANN will accept and implement that change and not mince words.
So who takes the leadership role to make sure that happens?
That's a great question, because that role is going to end up falling to the community first, to NTIA, who will basically say whether they support the community transition plan that's up here. And that is why we said to this committee, do your best to support and encourage that NTIA insist that ICANN
So to some extent, NTIA has a veto. Today, that's the ultimate arbiter of this. They've got a veto. And
for the last time.
For the last time, so they need to make sure they exercise that, and the community needs to make sure we in Congress know if there's something that's about to.
Secretary Strickling says all the time that it would be a failure of the entire process if we ended up having a veto. Just like I said to Representative Shimkus, it would be a failure if GAO studied it and came back and said this will never work. We have to be engaged now, and NTIA is, and thankfully Congress is as well. By engaging early, there's no risk that we get to the end of the road and say, this fails.
Right, but it's our fail-safe, if you will. Yeah, would anyone else like to comment here as we're closing out?
I would like to make
go
two
ahead.
things. One, I just can't emphasize enough that it's important that these changes be implemented before the transition. The leverage leaves once that transition occurs, and NTIA no longer is in the position that it currently is in. And second, on the accountability track, there are two what they're calling work streams. There's work stream run, which there are the changes that they deem are so important they need to be in place before the transition occurs. That there's also work stream 2, which are deemed to be important, but not necessarily important enough to be in place before the transition occurs. Work stream 2 still has a lot of important things in there. And there needs to be a great deal of assurances from ICANN and from the multi-stakeholder community through this process that those work stream 2 items will not be forgotten once this transition occurs.
So what is the timing? If you were to say, you know, there's not a date certain, a time certain, is there? I mean, so the clock's kind of ticking, but when do you see this, you know, reaching some endpoint?
Your first crack, as the chart I put up there showed, early next spring would be the earliest, and it might go as long as late next summer into next autumn.
But we're talking about within a year.
Yes, sir, and I should answer with respect to work stream 1 and 2. The community believes that, this is in response to what Brett said, we aim to give the community sufficient powers in work stream 1 so that the board management cannot block the implementation of our work stream 2 items. So if we have the powers we've described to you, and we get to work stream 2 time in 2017 and the board is not going to concede, that's when we start invoking powers like spilling the board, challenging their decisions.
And who sets the board? I mean, are there going to be 20 people on the board, and who picks them? I know how shareholders work in private corporations. This is a little bit more confusing than that.
The board is it's kind of an interesting and complex structure. There's a board member that's appointed by a technical community. There's 2 board members that are appointed by the generic name supporting organization. We have this country code organizations, Security and Stability Advisory Committee, the Root Server Committee. The governments have a non-voting board member. There's the nominating committee.
So are we talking about 30, 40 people, 100 people?
20-ish.
20-ish people. And they could be replaced, I'm assuming, by the nominating group. Like, does the NTIA get to put 2 people on or nothing? Interesting. Well, I guess I have 3 seconds left or so, so I'll yield that back and thank the panelists for your dedication to this issue, which is pretty deep in the weeds, but a very important thing. So, yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chairman has 5 hours of questioning. Good, you're paying attention. 5 minutes. I want to sum up. It's pretty clear that back home, people are more concerned about what will happen if some foreign government that's hostile to our nation takes over the roles played by ICANN right now. I'm a former naval aviator, so we plan the worst case scenario, what bad could really happen. So if this bad things happen after this transition occurs, what is our recourse? What can we do to stop this from happening in the future? If ICANN goes into effect, all of a sudden some bad actors take over, can we stop it? Can we recover? Because that's what they're concerned about back home. We turn it over and then it goes over forever. I mean, do we have some sort of break or some sort of mechanism to say,
Right.
no?
And we have several stress tests about that, and it can be most easily summed up by saying that if the community, the people that actually use the top-level domain table, the root table, believe that it has gone off the rails, that governments are suppressing free expression or commerce, they will take the IANA contract away from ICANN and give it to someone else. And that can be done in an instant. The root table's small enough to fit on an index card, and it can be hosted by others and replicated around the world. So the ability of separability, Audrey talked about this earlier, everyone agreed we needed that. That is our ultimate trump card against the scenario you described.
And Ms. Plonk, you're nodding your head. Do you agree with that? Want to add anything, ma'am?
I do. I would only add that the other two communities, Numbers and Protocols, also have plans for how they will internally, transition if that needs to happen.
Ms. Kale?
I would also add that I think that this idea, it is always important to remember that we are a part of the community, and by that I mean the panelists here and also the U.S. government. So we are stakeholders in this system as it goes forward, and I think the shared goals of planning against that worst case scenario and the goals of protecting the free and open internet are ones that are broadly shared by members of the community in the United States and around the world. And there is this really active group of civil society, of companies, of academia, and of governments that are dedicated to these issues, and they're very vigilant in making sure that we avoid those kinds of scenarios. And so we are still a part of that community, and that's really powerful.
Mr. Shears, your comments, sir.
Thank you. I would say that the measures that we're trying to put in place on the accountability side are designed to militate against capture and a mission creep, and that's part of that process, as you say, of what happens when things go wrong. We're working in a system now. Hopefully we'll put in place measures where that will be a very slim chance of that happening.
Mr. Schaefer, your comments, sir.
I would just like to echo a statement made by Mr. Shears in his opening statement about how all these issues and these measures are intertwined. They're interreliant on each other, and I would highly recommend against moving forward on one without moving forward on all of them together.
So y'all seem, if I just want to put words in your mouth, y'all seem to think that this is okay, it's safe, we don't have to worry about, there's all sorts of checks, we don't know what will happen, but if bad things happen, we can stop it, control it. Yes, Mr. Billy Del Bianco, Ms. Kale, Ms. Plonk? Okay, well, guys, I have one last comment. I'll follow up on the comments by Chairman Barton, former Chairman Barton, and Mr. Doyle from Pennsylvania about moving the headquarters of ICANN to another country. Do those options include a state that was a former country? Is that considered another country like the state Republic of Texas? Does that work for there? Because again, you've got me, if that's what's going to happen. Is that consideration? Laughter, okay. Members have 5 days to submit questions for the record. Without objection, this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.
No takers. It's another country.